James, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Roman.
Awesome. Let's start at the very beginning. Maybe somebody's watching this interview and they don't know anything about the Heartland Institute. Can you briefly introduce what it is and what type of work you do?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Heartland Institute is a free market public policy organization. We're based outside Chicago. And what we do is we look for freedom-oriented solutions to the problems that confront society. So basically, we're advocates for freedom.
Wow. And do you have a focus? Because it's called the Heartland Institute, so I imagine, as soon as I hear it, I think of farmland and things like that. Does it have a focus on AG, agriculture?
We tackle all sorts of topics. We're best known for standing up for climate realism, taking on climate alarmism. We're called the Heartland Institute because we are based in Chicago. It's in the Midwest, and we've been there since 1984. So when we were first formed, we were addressing issues in Chicago, then in Illinois, then throughout the Midwest. But as we've grown, I guess maybe we might have outgrown our name, but we still like it.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned just then is climate realism. And so we conducted this investigation, which wound up culminating in this documentary called No Farmers, No Food. And what we found was that pretty much every climate problem is oftentimes addressed by a very drastic top-down solution that would essentially consolidate more power at the top and take control of people's lives at the bottom. That seems to be the way it's moving forward. And it's all justified because, hey, we have this climate emergency and we need to solve it. It's an existential threat. So yeah, you might need to forego some of your freedoms, but do you want to have not have a planet and have less freedoms, or just be dead, right? That seems to be the binary choice. What would you tell someone who has bought into that line of thinking?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that we can't have a climate crisis if temperatures are unusually cool. And we know for a fact, the United Nations has acknowledged it and put out their own temperature history chart showing this, that for most of the time period that human civilization has existed, temperatures have been warmer than today. The warming that we've had in the last 100, 150 years, it's because 150 years ago we were in the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period of the past 10,000 years. So we have people who have a political agenda who have brainwashed much of society into believing that temperatures are unusually hot, we're having record temperatures. Hogwash. And moreover, the asserted climate harms, whether it be hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, none of them are getting more frequent or severe. In fact, the vast majority of them are becoming less frequent and severe. So we're seeing not only do we not have the heat that people talk about, but the impacts of warmer temperatures have always been more beneficial, and they continue to be today.
You're essentially saying that the premise is incorrect, that there is no climate emergency that needs to therefore implement a sort of globalist top-down control. Is that correct?
Right. And in fact, with more atmospheric carbon dioxide, with warmer temperatures, the benefits far outweigh the harms. We know, for example, NASA satellites have shown that there has been a substantial greening of the Earth. When you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's basically plant food. So NASA has documented a substantial increase in global foliage. We also know that about 20 times more people die from cold than from heat around the globe. And if we have a modest warming that continues, what it means is that we're saving 20 lives for every one life that's lost due to more heat. That's just a couple of things. Also, we know that crop production has been increasing in virtually every country in the world, long-term, mid-term, and short-term, again, because of more atmospheric carbon dioxide, longer growing seasons. These are things that the media don't cover.
Let me ask you this. I can imagine that some of the people pushing these policies, you can, if you're cynical or if you're a bit more realistic, you can say, well, their agenda, their true agenda is the consolidation of power. But what about the scientists that are oftentimes cited? Because it seems like the whole 99% of scientists agree that humans are contributing to the climate. Well, that's been disproven multiple times, right? But I still believe that there is a large contingent of scientists that do believe that this is what's happening. So what's going on there? Do they see it differently, or are they bought and paid for? Like, what's your opinion?
Well, I think the vast majority of scientists who believe in a climate crisis, and by the way, that number is nowhere 99%. We just conducted a poll. We had Fairleigh Dickinson University actually conduct the poll. We asked them to do so, but they conducted it to make sure that it was done on the up and up, that we don't somehow, subconsciously change the results or anything. They found that only 59%, less than 60% of scientists expect any significant harm during their entire lifetimes. And significant, of course, if it's not significant, it's insignificant. We're not even talking a crisis. We're just saying, do you expect some significant harms during our lifetime? only 59%. But anyway, for those scientists who believe in that, I would imagine that most of them truly believe in that. They can look at the scientific evidence and trust computer models actually over the evidence. When you look at the actual data and the facts, you just don't see any of these predicted harms come true. But hey, they can believe in their climate models. The climate models have failed, but they can do so. But for many of these scientists, their jobs disappear, their livelihoods disappear. There's been such a tremendous growth in the climate change industry. For example, NASA. NASA used to be about exploring space. Now NASA is about promoting climate change alarmism. If and when it's proven and it's accepted that we're not facing a climate crisis, all of these jobs disappear. So if you work for the federal government, if you work for a university that's funded by federal dollars, you know that your job, your livelihood, your fame in the media is dependent upon those dollars. Now, I believe that still most of the scientists, they talk themselves into believing that their climate models will win out. I don't think, I would hope that most of them aren't deliberately saying things that they don't believe are true, but you have an incentive to see things a certain way in the scientific community.
Actually, when you were just describing that, I remember this article I read maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks ago about a scientist who came out and he said that he was essentially peer pressured into changing his conclusions and his methodology of research, because I believe he was researching wildfires and he had some other hypotheses that he was trying to test as to what's causing the wildfires rather than climate change. But he said that due to the publishing structure of the publication, he felt like he had to kind of shoehorn the climate into his conclusion and his methodology.
You had a scientist who wanted to get his paper published. That is how you get prominence. That is how, if you're a university professor, that you get tenure. You want to get published in the peer-reviewed journals. And he knew that he'd have to come to a certain conclusion, promoting a climate crisis, that he'd have to leave out evidence, arguments that would mitigate what his paper would be interpreted as. And afterwards, he felt bad about it. But what's really interesting about this scientist is that he had just recently, about a year or two ago, he was one of the people that was employed by Facebook to fact-check a John Stossel video in which John Stossel had climate scientists on a panel that he was interviewing. And this same scientist had done the fact-check and had assisted Facebook in censoring and diminishing the impact of these videos. And so he participated in this himself. I guess he's finally gotten a conscience on this, but that's what goes on, in today's society, where you have this preconceived and enforced agenda that you cannot allow any dissent to the climate crisis, even by credentialed scientists.
That's quite a situation you lay out, because it's like in the scientific literature, you have this bias towards this conclusion. Then in the mainstream social media and, of course, mainstream media, it's also biased. It's like the John Stossel video is an excellent example. That video is great. Very, very well researched, very well packaged. It's very rational, but it got its reach reduced significantly. And you just imagine how many other videos have gotten their reach reduced. We just don't know about it. And so it creates this situation, not even among the scientists, but among the general public as well, that, hey, this is happening, everyone agrees this is happening, and now let's look for a solution. So let's move on to the solution, because the premise now is that everyone, well, not everyone, but enough of the general population believe that this is happening. And so solutions are being implemented, or they're being proposed. What is your opinion on Agenda 30 by 30?
Well, 30 by 30, first of all, the primary justification that's been promoted for this is climate change. In the White House's announcement of the 30 by 30 program, they say this is to defend against, protect against climate change. So, of course, the underlying premise is simply wrong. But the 30 by 30 agenda itself, this is really amusing because, it's tragic, but it's also amusing. So what they present to the American people is, look, shouldn't we be protecting, conserving, setting aside just 30% of the land for nature, for future generations? Well, government already owns 37% of the land in this country. Why do we need to take any more land? Government already owns more than enough. If people want to set aside 30% of that land, well, then go talk to your government and ask them why they haven't done so. Don't go taking other people's lands. Don't go trying to put aside land that's currently in productive use under this false notion that we don't have enough land set aside or owned by government. This is simply a bureaucracy empowerment act that has nothing to do with land conservation. Again, the people in this country own less than 2/3 of the land. That's amazing in the land of the free.
The Agenda 30 by 30, according to the research of your institute, how far along has it gotten?
Well, it's gotten to the point that you have not just the usual suspects, the Biden administration, the environmental left groups, but some Republicans who want to show that they have a heart, who want to show that they're concerned about the environment and don't really get the issue. They don't understand that we're already setting aside more than 30% of land, or at least government already owns more than 30% of land. And so they buy into it thinking that, well, this will soften my edge, my perception with voters. And that's something that we need to do. We need to educate Republicans and Democrats and independents to let them know the truth about the issue, and that is that government already owns 37% of the land. And the agenda is not about preserving open land and spaces and beautifying the country, because people do that better than the government. As an example, California Governor Gavin Newsom has just recently sued oil companies. And his justification, one of his primary justifications was, he said, we have all these wildfires, and if we'd known the facts, we could have taken steps to protect against wildfires. Well, here's a fact. According to NASA, they have satellite instruments that have been measuring precisely the amount of land burned by wildfires. They've been doing this since 1998. What they show definitively is that wildfires across the globe have decreased by 24%. That's a large number. So if wildfires are increasing in California, but not the rest of the world, what's the reason for that? It's not that Mother Nature is conspiring against California. It's that government owns 48% of the land in California, and state government in particular is mismanaging their resources. Where you have privately owned lands, where people take care of their land, where people prevent it, where they take steps to prevent wildfires, or at least prevent them from getting that extreme, you see better land management, you see fewer wildfires. So again, the accumulation of land by government is not the same as making the land more beautiful or more safe from catastrophic events. In fact, it's just the opposite. Because
that was going to be my next question to you. What would be the problem with the government taking up so much land? Because again, if somebody just buys into this line of thought, this train of thought, I can imagine them saying, like, okay, like we have Yellowstone National Park, it's beautiful, I'd like to visit it, I'd like my grandkids to be able to visit it. Why don't we make more of the country like that, nice and accessible? Yeah, what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, Yellowstone's beautiful largely because Yellowstone's beautiful. I mean, it would be nice if the whole country looked like Yellowstone. Maybe we'd get tired of all the beauty, but anyway, certain places, there's a very good argument for the most beautiful of places to saying, hey, let's keep it this way. But when you get to 30% of the land, and in this case even more so, because again, government owns 37%, that's a little much. That prevents people from developing land. It prevents people from making a living off the land. It prevents the type of entrepreneurial spirit that America is known for. In the old Soviet Union, the government owned all the land. You saw that the land was destroyed with pollution, with neglect, with people not caring for the land because they don't own the land. They don't have an incentive for it. I think when you look at lands that are managed by government, federal or state government, what you see is neglect, mismanagement, whereas if people own their lands, they have an incentive to make sure that they're managed well.
I think that's really well said. Same thing in China. When you have these collectivist plot of land, it's like, yeah, no one's really in charge of it anymore, right? So it's like, well, it's not my problem, right? There's an issue. So Agenda 30 by 30 is one of the kind of very, has that name that sort of echoes the Agenda 2030 at the UN level, so it's like very obvious. What are some of the other methods that the federal government is using to implement Agenda 2030 in the country? In the course of our investigation, we found that they were using things like the Endangered Species Act, the Waterways of the U.S. Act. Is there, besides those two, are there any other methods that the U.S. government is using?
Well, really anything they can. If the government is able to, for example, prevent energy production on lands that are set aside specifically for energy production. For example, you have the National Petroleum Reserve up in Alaska, and it's set aside by Congress specifically for petroleum production, and yet you have the Biden administration rendering most of that off limits for energy production. So you have a de facto government taking of the land and setting it aside. And what's interesting for the 30 by 30 folks, they won't consider that land as fulfilling their 30 by 30 mission. If they were to get their way, the 30 by 30 supporters, it wouldn't be 30% of the land set aside. It would be about 70 or 80% because they make up excuses to not qualify land that is set aside and not available for individuals to access, to use, or develop. Again, we're already well over 30%. Stop already.
Well, Vermont recently, they implemented a 30 by 30 goal, but within that goal, there was a 50 by 50 goal as well. So it's like a ramping up period.
Yeah, and that's what they do. It's a first step. Their proponents for 30 by 30 have come out openly and said this is a first step. Senator Udall, I believe a few years ago, said that his goal is 50 by 50, and once they get to 50 by 50, it'll be 80 by 80. It's the same thing that the environmental left has done with carbon dioxide emissions and their net zero goal. 10, 20 years ago, they were talking 30 by 30. Then it became 50 by 50. Now it's total zero. So these are games they play.
Let me ask you this. It seems like, well, again, throughout the course of our investigation, we were able to find like many different groups, organizations, different kind of informal treaties and alliances that all kind of coalesce into this picture that people will be forced, or the regulations will make it such that they will be living in urban center cities. Most of the country will just be either inaccessible or owned by the federal government and rewilded. And that's it. There'll be like 15-minute cities. The net zero agenda will play into that. You have the Agenda 2030 playing into that, all these other things playing into it, not just here in the US, but across the world. The way it's kind of coalescing into the package, right? It's almost like there's somebody pushing it along behind the scenes. Is that the case from your research, that somebody is actually saying, well, this is our end goal, that we think that this is the best mode for society in order to be sustainable, to have X amount of people pushed into cities, everything is managed by the government outside of the cities, there's, everything is accessible, the protein is based on, either synthetic meat or bugs because it's better for the environment. Is there someone who has this master plan in mind, or is it more like this ideology and it's all kind of coalescing and it sort of looks from the outside like it's planned, but it's not really planned? What's your opinion?
Well, you have the environmental left elites that, much like you have for any ideological movement, you have people that are committed to it, that discuss it among themselves, that talk about plans, action plans to put them into action, to put these ideas into action, and that's what you have. Are there particular individuals? Well, you have, for example, the World Economic Forum with Klaus Schwab has been promoting this type of society globally for decades. And they're not very secret about it. It's right in their planning. The United Nations has been pushing for this land set aside for government as well. And then when you have people who believe in this ideology or this agenda, now you have the foot soldiers on the ground. It doesn't take necessarily one particular person cackling and putting the plans in motion. It just takes people in the movement to do so. And you make an interesting point about forcing people into urban centers or into towns. You mentioned Vermont earlier. I went to college just across the river from Vermont in New Hampshire. I spent a lot of time in Vermont. Most of Vermont is already set aside and not able for people to develop. You have the Green Mountains and particularly the White Mountains in Vermont. You have more than 30% of the state that is not developed and that's set aside for this, and yet you have people pushing for more because they want to keep people in the towns, in the cities. If you go to Europe, you'll see that most people live in flats. They don't own a house. They live with neighbors above them, neighbors below them, neighbors next to them, sharing a common wall. If that's how they want to do it, fine, good for them. But here in the United States of America, that's not how we envision our future and how we envision freedom. And we have plenty of land.
Recently, there's been a bigger push by the mainstream media to push the climate alarmism, let's call it. I remember Project Veritas did a phenomenal video where they showed, as COVID was waning down, they were doing an undercover video with, I believe, a producer at CNN, and the guy said something like, well, our next thing will be climate. We're going to really ramp up the climate stuff. And it seems like that's true. Like there's been a lot of great pictures where people put on social media where it's like, in 2008, here was a weather map, and in 2023, here's a similar weather map. The temperatures are the same, but this one's like red, blazing hot. This one is green, right? Because it's like, well, just summer temperatures. And just as an anecdote, I put that map on Instagram, that meme where it compares the two, and Instagram took it down, saying it's like fake news, like you're not allowed to share this has been disproven, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, it's for your eyes right there. What's leading to the mainstream media accelerating this push?
Well, you have in the mainstream media, they've always tilted to the left anyway. So from an ideological perspective, they would like to suppress any information that is contrary to the climate alarmist narrative. You also have literally tens of millions of dollars that are being given to, for example, Reuters and the Associated Press from leftist policy organizations specifically to cover climate change. And when they say cover climate change, when you have a climate alarmist organization from the left that says, we're going to give you Associated Press, Reuters, for-profit media entity, we're just going to give you tens of millions of dollars because we want you to cover climate change. Well, you know what you're going to do. You have your marching orders. You go out, you find stories, you make up stories, and you give it a sole angle. Back when I joined Heartland in 2001, for approximately the first decade that I was there, when there was a climate change article in the media, reporters would reach out to people from all points of view. Now they don't do that, because if they do so, they're going to risk losing their funding from these leftist organizations. I used to be able to get editorials placed not only in mainstream media, I used to get them placed in mainstream media all the time, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, you name it. But now even conservative websites will hesitate to publish mine or articles from climate scientists with the PhDs and the peer-reviewed articles and articles in peer-reviewed journals, because what will happen is you have YouTube and Google and others, they will downgrade not just that article, but then they will punish every article published by this website. So they know if they publish an article, whether it's from James Taylor at the Heartland Institute, or whether it's from, say, Willie Soon, who has all the degrees and credentials in the world, if they publish that article, then everything they publish on any topic is going to be censored and suppressed, so they can't do it anymore.
Wow, that's shocking. So the environment has just changed. The funding and the censorship environment has changed such that other opinions are just getting squeezed out. Is
right,
that the
right.
case?
And as much as ideology was the primary justification for this and reason for this, now when you throw on tens of millions of dollars from leftist public policy organizations, that's the final nail in the coffin. The only way to get information to people is to go around the mainstream media. Fortunately, this isn't 1975 where you just have 3 networks and a few national newspapers. We have the internet. We have a bevy of news and media organizations outside the mainstream that we can get information to people.
Yeah, I guess that's a silver lining there. Last question. If somebody just watched this interview and they've had their minds open and they want to maybe look through something comprehensive that goes point by point for each specific claim made by the mainstream media, or that they're hearing over and over again, and goes deeper into it, perhaps debunks it or gives it more nuance. Do you have any documents like that?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Actually, we have a website, climateataglance.com. And there we have topic by topic, so hurricanes, droughts, coral reefs, you name it. We have, it's basically 2 pages per topic, so it's concise enough that it's not going to overwhelm you. We have a few bullet points that summarize the topic. Then we have a short summary with the citations to the hardcore scientific evidence. If you go there, you will get everything you need to understand each of the most frequently discussed climate change topics.
If anyone's watching it, I'll throw that link to that website down in the description box below. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Roman.